All right, Mike Helmar, we are live and recording. We are in very unprecedented times, but that doesn't mean our work stops. So can you talk just a little bit about what we're seeing out there in regard to COVID-19, the coronavirus?
Well, it has impacted all facets of our daily living, as everybody well knows. I mean, everybody's feeling it. Everything from social interaction to entertainment to work, which is a big problem, and even routine purchases, routine errands, things like that. We just can't go out and do the things that we normally would do. But those impacts go beyond just being insulated from other people or from being barred from going into stores. Some stores are shut or some businesses are closed up. There's a huge economic impact that is only going to get worse. And the economic impact is not just from the loss of jobs and the loss of income, even though many businesses, to their credit, are trying to pay employees, even though they may not be working, and there may be some government programs. Those can only go so far. Money is finite. Mm-hmm. But so we have the loss of income, but we also have the loss of wealth. The stock market has dropped, just as an example, has dropped about 10,000 points since the beginning of this thing. And that's about 35+% on the stock market. So there's a huge loss of wealth that will have an impact on retirees' incomes, on the ability to purchase large items, particularly vehicles, homes, and that nature, for a while until it recovers. And then the global markets are strained too. This is not just a U.S. phenomenon, as we well know. It didn't begin here, although it has impacted us very, very strongly. So we have global sorts of impacts and issues with this.
Now, Mike, you said it dropped by 10,000 points. Where else in history have we seen this dramatic of a drop in this fast of a time?
Well, we can't just look at the point totals. We have to look at the percentages. Even in the Great Recession of 2009, we had some big 1,000, maybe a couple thousand point drops in a day, before. But the total decline was not as great as this. We're getting into Great Depression sorts of losses. Mm-hmm. Now, having said that, I'm not certainly predicting that we're in a depression yet. Mm-hmm. That's quite possible, depending on how long this thing persists and the impacts on the economy. But those are the sorts of losses that we've seen now. I mean, we're talking about Great Depression back in 1929.
Okay. Now, the one thing I'm real curious about, and I know we're going off your bullet points a little bit, but I think it's an important question, is that a lot of our industries are really still chugging along. I don't want to say normally, they're not normal, but manufacturing, distribution, mining, construction, they're still moving. Is that going to help us?
Well, that will certainly help us. It'll keep particularly. I mean, let's start with mining. We're going to go right into crude materials. That's kind of where this thing starts. Mm-hmm. As long as we keep getting those supplies, metals, coal, and then we can move into things like agricultural products for one. Right. And anything else that produces crude materials, the oil and gas industries, which have been severely hit, those certainly help. I mean, that's kind of the beginning of the supply chain. Manufacturing, that'll continue to chug along, but it just depends on profits and profit margins. Initially, they will try to keep going because if they shut down and then have to start up again, there are some costs to that. And they're also trying to keep the supply chain going. So that will certainly help the economy. But once we move beyond those sorts of goods industries, we start talking about many of our services that aren't vital services, mm-hmm. Things that we've heard various states, and our own state of Nevada as well. The governor has shut some things down, restaurants, casinos, bars, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. When we start shutting those things down, we begin to have a real impact on people's incomes.
Right. Okay. Well, let's talk about agriculture in particular. You are an ag economist, and I know you've been watching this. So what's been happening in the last couple of weeks?
Well, if we go back to about the 20th of January, that kind of seems to be a break point date. And if we go from the beginning of January to the 20th, prices were up and down of agricultural commodities a bit. But once we hit the 20th of January, which is around the time we started hearing a lot of the dire things coming out of China, we saw prices drop for many ag commodities, particularly the ones that we produce in Nevada. We talk about, cattle, beef cattle, dairy, sheep and wool, those sorts of things. Those are our three big livestock industries in this state. We saw those prices drop, but then they kind of leveled out. But we hit about the 17th of the third week of February. There was a drastic drop, and that's about the time we started seeing these impacts. Talking about other countries severe, it started to show up in the U.S. about that time. I mean, those dates may not be exactly the right, but that's about the time that markets started feeling that, and we've seen a huge drop in feeder steer prices, which follow live cattle prices, slaughter steer prices. Feeder steer prices, the milk prices dropped even more. Global wool prices about that time. If you look at the Australian price, they kind of set the wool price for the world. They're the biggest ones, and Nevada has to follow along with that. Those all dropped in about the last 3 to 4 weeks. We've seen a very big drop.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. What happens if COVID-19 persists? What can we see there?
Well, if it persists, we stay isolated. People aren't able to work. Even the bailout packages and businesses paying their employees, even though they're not working, particularly small businesses, will be strained. They just won't have the wherewithal to do that. We're really going to hit the incomes in this country, and we're going to really drop consumption more than it already has been. Consumption has not. There are no numbers out yet. Consumption hasn't dropped as severely as it can. And the thing we're worried about consumption is that's about 2/3 of the economy, about 2/3 of GDP is consumption, things that you and I buy. So when that starts hitting there, then we're really going to tank the economy, and that'll have a snowball effect. That will then hit all industries. And the recession gets worse to perhaps a depression.
Okay. So not looking good at the moment, but we are a resilient country. So we haven't seen what we're experiencing now before, but we've certainly been through tough times before. What happens if low prices persists for the next few months? What can we expect to see?
Yeah, well, let's talk about industries, and then we'll talk specifically about agriculture. But any industry that sees the low prices, particularly if their cost structure doesn't fall enough to offset those, which in some cases it might. Fuel prices are way down. If those oil prices persist, we begin to see profit margins erode, and companies take losses, and they just can't operate. So we have the economy just going into, I don't want to say free fall. I don't want to sound dire at this point. But the economy really contracts very, very sharply. And then if we look at ag in particular, right now we're at places where we've seen, for example, our feeder steer prices are off about 20 or 25%. That's a huge drop. Now, this year, before this hit, looked like it was going to be a pretty decent year for cow-calf producers in this state. Prices were moving up, but now, as we start looking at the prices, we're now back to prices that we saw in 2016, and maybe even a little lower than that. 2016 was our bottom year in this cycle. That was a tough year for them. They took losses. So that's what we're back at, that they'll take losses if this persists longer. Having said that, if this turns around relatively quickly, and I frankly don't think it will, but should it do that and those prices come back up, we may get through most of the period where we don't have a lot of marketings of cattle yet anyway. If prices can come back up at the time that the ranchers are selling their calves and their feeder steers, they may be able to weather this. But if this persists for another couple of months, longer than that, then they're going to be starting to sell into very low prices, and they're going to take huge losses. And the same will be for our dairy producers. As a matter of fact, those guys are already seeing it because milk is on a daily basis.
Right. Right.
So they're already seeing those losses. We've had milk prices in the last 3 weeks not be off as much as the other things. But if we go back to the very beginning of the year, we've got milk prices off between 15 and 20%.
Wow.
So they're hit just about as bad. And milk product prices, if we look at whole milk powder prices, I looked at some today, they're off, 10 to 15% on the global market. And that goes right back to our milk producers that produce at the Fallon milk plant, the whole milk powder plant. That makes it tough for that plant to do business.
Mm-hmm.
And just by looking at those prices, when we start talking about just not only whole milk powder, but other dairy product prices, non-fat dry milk, butter, those things are off as well. And that begins to hit our Southern Nevada dairies as well, because they serve not only some fluid milk in their area, but they also serve some of the manufacturing in Southern California as well. So
Okay.
we're going to hit the dairy across the state.
Wow. Another issue that I know some of our producers rely on are these foreign ag workers that come into the U.S. just to work on the visas. How's that going to impact us?
That was an article that showed up, I think, in the Wall Street Journal this morning,
Mm-hmm.
and that will have a very large impact. Labor costs in agriculture are a big part of a producer's costs, and if he has to then, frankly, use American workers they may be tight. You got to raise the wages because a lot of Americans don't want to do that kind of work. I mean, I hate to say those sorts of things,
Mm-hmm.
but those are the facts. Then their labor costs are going to go up, and we may not be able to get enough workers to do it who are inclined to do that. Our dependence on Mexican and even some Central American workers in agriculture in the U.S., particularly the Western U.S., is very great. And that could pose a real problem in terms of just getting the crops out of the field and into the supply chain.
Okay. Wow. All right. So I guess maybe last question. We're talking about a low price period, taking some losses. What about federal disaster relief? I literally, before we got on this meeting, I saw that some of our members of our delegation are pushing for, rather than a 2.75% low interest loan from the Small Business Administration, we're now talking maybe 0%, which for some of us who run small businesses might be a good thing. What do we know about that, or what can you say about that?
Well, at this point in time, not only our congressional delegation, but that of very many states, and when you bring them all together in Congress, they're kind of dealing with this information like we are when it comes in. They do not necessarily know everything, and they're trying to do the best that they can. Lower interest rates would certainly help a lot. Now, we saw the Fed make a move last week and drop interest rates, and I think that kind of sets the stage for that to happen more. The problem is will lenders be able to do it? Will lenders be willing to do it? You may be able to drop the interest rate, but if a lender doesn't think that a borrower will be able to cash flow and pay him back then later in the year, they may not lend to them regardless of what the interest rates are, regardless of whether or not the producer wants to borrow. That remains to be seen, to shake out how those things are, because we have some very big risks going on here. And now lenders are required to be able to remain solvent even in relatively large times. This kind of came out of the 2019, the 2009 recession, that lenders are required to be able to have a certain amount of money to serve those portfolios. If this persists much longer, that's going to be strained, and lending will be tough. I mean, it won't only be for regular industry business lending, which as they run through their cash to pay employees, they may have to borrow coming out of this thing.
Mm-hmm.
but it will also be for our agricultural producers that are a risky industry in the first place.
Hmm.
And if they are already carrying some debt behind them, the institutions may not want to lend to them.
Okay. Wow. Any last thoughts?
Well, what I'm hoping is that because these are extraordinary times, and we've seen this already happen, is that businesses, the government, and all are going to do extraordinary things. I
Hmm.
hope that continues, but again, it depends on how much cash there is to do it. Like I said, cash is finite, and you may not be able to do it forever. There are more things to consider, even though you talked about Congress or some of our Congress people in the state of Nevada. To their credit, thank them very much for that. We're looking at lowering interest rates. What is going to happen for agriculture is, particularly if this persists and these low prices persist, is there's going to have to be some sort of ad hoc disaster relief bills going through Congress. And I really would like our Congress people, none of whom are on either House or Senate committee.
Hmm.
We're just not that kind of state that is their bailiwick. But
Okay.
I want them to be cognizant of this so that they can add to the discussion and the deliberation on the floor and help push for some of these things, particularly for livestock producers, the Western agriculture, which
Hmm.
may not and often does not get as much of representation as some of the Midwestern and Eastern that are more crop oriented. So
Okay.
I really want that to happen. We will need some disaster relief for livestock producers.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Another question that just came up is impacts to supply chains, and how that impacts maybe the packers, and how will that impact farmers and ranchers?
Well, the supply chain vertically above them needs to keep moving. Otherwise, they can't move their products. They can't move their animals. They can't move their milk.
Hmm.
I mean, if the bottlers were to shut down because of close proximity of workers in the plant, uh, or the milk processing plants closed down, you just don't move that milk. And these guys are sitting there with a bunch of cows that are lactating, that are producing milk, and it's not going anywhere. And we'd see we would then, this is a dire thing, would
Hmm.
then see herd reductions and things of that nature. But supply chains have to keep moving, otherwise goods just don't move to the market. And if goods don't move to the market, you and I don't eat.
Sure.
And so it's a snowball all throughout all of society. Having said that, the things that I've read and the things that I'm seeing from the feds and from the states are keeping the highways open,
Hmm.
storms notwithstanding here in the West this time of year. They're keeping the highways open. They're keeping the supply chain open, and we're also seeing not only from the government doing that, but we're also starting to see some of the private industry chip in on that. They know that truckers, for example, have to eat on the road. And so
Hmm.
there have been some of them that are saying, particularly ones that have a large enough parking lot to get a big rig in, you come in, you call in your order, and we'll come and serve it out to your truck. We've got to feed these guys and women. We
Yeah.
absolutely have to. So it's not just the government, but the supply chain is very much privately run, and it's just going to take cooperation. And right now, the supply chains are still running at least adequately.
Hmm. I did speak with Paul Enos with the Nevada Trucking Association last week, and he said exactly what you just said. The trucks are moving. We just need to move them a little quicker. And so I'm keeping my fingers crossed.
Well, the fuel prices will certainly help that as long as the fuel keeps coming.
Sure.
And also, I noticed that I live in an area where, as I drive in and out of town, there's a lot of warehouses.
Hmm.
They're still open
Yeah.
and running.
Yeah.
So that wholesale part of the supply chain is still working.
Is that going to have kind of a buffering effect from all these other impacts we're seeing with closed bars and restaurants and things?
Well, it keeps that segment of them of the population employed.
Hmm.
Um, One of the other things that we're seeing is, the bars and stuff that are closed. I mean, those are just businesses that are shut down. Those businesses aren't going to make any money, but some of their employees, federal payments coming or payments coming from their employer, not, are great.
Hmm.
but some of those can also pick up some part-time work. We're also seeing signs on a lot of grocery stores or other sorts of retail places that are allowed to be open, saying, and even some drive-through restaurants hiring people to do the curbside service, to deliver, things of that nature. So there's some of that going on as well. But closing those other things, those what are termed non-essential businesses, and is going to impact the economy. We're not going to be made whole of this until this thing is over with and we get everybody back to work and get the economy running back to normal so that consumption and demand are return to normal.
Great. So buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy road for a while.
Yes, sir, it is.
Thank you so much, Mike. Really appreciate your time today.
Yep. My pleasure, Bob.
Yeah, we'll keep doing these.
All right.
All right. Thanks.
Yep.